Briefing everything up again, I'll brief you up what goes before Stuart regime. I'll begin from Tudor regime. Tudor regime begins soon after the War of Roses. The War of Roses occurs between 1455 and 1485. For 30 years, this continues. This is called the War of the Roses. This war occurs between two houses of the parliament, Lancastrians and Yorkists, they are called. Lancastrians and Yorkists. The difference between the two is that one wants the kingdom to be taken from one lineage, the other wants the kingdom to be continued from another lineage. Okay, I'll not go into the details of which son of which king did Lancastrians want to come to the throne and what did Yorkists want. In this fight, this is called War of the Roses because they would wear white and red roses to represent that they favor different houses. This continued from 1455 to 1485. Ultimately, it came to an end in 1485, and this is where the fight ends because somebody else who is neither this nor this person, somebody else from elsewhere comes in and ends the fight. His name is Henry. Henry becomes the next king, so the Y7 is added to it. He does not belong to the same regime. The regime that is ruling at this point in time is called the Plantagenet dynasty. Plantagenet dynasty, the houses that fight fall in another regime which is called Plantagenet dynasty. I mean, I think this will never end if I keep on going backwards. So coming forward, Henry VII begins the Tudor regime. He calls his regime the Tudor regime, and he's the first of the rulers who starts ruling from 1485. I'll not also give you the dates of the rest of the kings who followed the rule of Henry VII, uh, but I'll only give you the names of the Tudor regime. The first ruler is Henry VII, followed by Henry VIII. Henry VIII is a very bad ruler, very very bad ruler, uh, because he wants to annul his marriage with the one he has married, the queen he has married, because he falls in love with one of the uh, mistresses and then wants to marry that mistress. The church does not allow the marriage because he already has his wife and he cannot marry her according to rules of the church, according to Christianity. So what does he do? He plots against the bishops and he gets them murdered, he gets them beheaded. Thomas More is one of the person who suffers at the hands of Henry VIII. He is also beheaded because he too does not support his marriage with the mistress. Thomas More is also beheaded. The bishops who are against this marriage of Henry VIII also do not support him. There are so many people against the marriage, but he ultimately does marry the female who's called Annie Boyle, the mistress. So he already has a wife, the other queen. So the children from one queen and the children from the other queen are who rule. Henry VIII has a problem that he is not able to bear a son. So in his spree to have a son, he marries 6 times. But even after marrying 6 women, all he has is one son. Many, many miscarriages of all the queens, a lot of miscarriages with each woman, and he also has 2 daughters. Those who live. This is the number of those who live. There are numbers, many number, innumerable children who die. The name of the son who does live is Edward. The name of the 2 daughters who live is Mary and Elizabeth. Edward also becomes a king, King Edward. Mary becomes a queen, Queen Mary. Elizabeth becomes a queen, Queen Elizabeth. What after that? King Edward has no kid. Queen Mary, all the children die. Queen Elizabeth does not marry. What will happen to the dynasty, to the regime? It will come to an end. So there are only these number of rulers that we have. Henry VII followed by Henry VIII. Henry VII was a good king. Henry VIII was a very bad king. Followed by Edward the Sixth. There have already been five Edwards, and he is the sixth or fourth. Yeah, he's the sixth Edward. And followed by, how is this king different, Edward Sixth? The difference in Edward Sixth is that he studies under uh, reformists, if you know the term Reformation. He studies under these reformists who bring in Protestantism into England. He is not a Catholic and doesn't follow Catholicism, though his father has been a stringent Catholic. Though he did not want to follow the Catholicism only in one point, that he wants to have so many wives. The rest, he was a Catholic king. But Edward VI was taught by reformist Protestant, therefore he becomes a Protestant. And what does he do is that he gets a lot of Catholics killed. Followed by Mary. Mary the First is a Catholic. She is the daughter of that queen, the marriage with whom was annulled, this queen. So she takes revenge of what her father had done to her mother. And what does she do? She gets all the Protestants killed. She murders people around 500 in her 5 years regime. She only rules for 5 years, but within that time, she murders around 500 Catholics and bishops. And the last of these is Queen Elizabeth. You may have studied about Queen Elizabeth, how she rules and how does it come to an end. She rules for a very long time, from 15. Can you tell me the date? From 15? Tell me the date of Queen Elizabeth's reign. Tell me. I'll not tell you. I'll leave it for you to figure out. What are the dates so that you remember it? And this comes to an end in 1603 with her death, leaving no heir. And this is why the lineage passes over to the Scottish kings, because one of the daughters of Henry VIII is married to Scottish rulers, and therefore the lineage passes over to the Scottish king James VI. James VI comes from the lineage of James Stuart I. So I erase this Tudor regime. This is where Tudor regime comes to an end. Tudor regime follows Plantagenet dynasty. Before Plantagenet dynasty, we have Anglo-Normans ruling. Before Anglo-Normans, we have Anglo-Saxons ruling. I repeat, Anglo-Saxons, followed by Anglo-Normans, followed by Plantagenet dynasty, followed by Tudor regime. And what we are dealing with, because we are doing Milton, Milton is born in 1608. He falls in the tradition of Stuart regime.
Stuart
So let's
regime.
begin Stuart regime. So why is politics important? I give you the example of Azadi by Arundhati Roy. This is also why the kind of writings that a writer writes, it must be allowed by the writer of that period. And if you're writing against the king of the time, you won't be allowed to write or publish in his place, the place that he is ruling. So this is how it works. This is why we study the politics of the time before we go into the study of the text. The text is, of course, very important. But before that, what is important is that you are able to place a writer on your own into the politics of the time, society of the time. So James I. is taken to be the first ruler of the Stuart dynasty. He rules from 1603 to 1625. Not a very long period, but the period that he has to rule is not very good for him. There are many challenges that he has to face. One is the financial crisis left behind by Queen Elizabeth. He has to take care of the financial crisis because Queen Elizabeth indulged into a lot of wars because the people who were suggesting her, the nobles she had in the court, made her fight with Spain, and that led to a loss of economy. If you indulged in wars like India does, what's it doing? Most of the budget, a large portion of the budget is spent on wars, which is not a healthy investment. Only safeguarding the borders is not a very healthy investment. What's happening then? It results in civil wars. Internally, your people are not happy because you are not spending the budget on them. Farmers are not happy with you because your budget is being flushed into somewhere which is like a draining away of economy. Similarly, Queen Elizabeth was doing the same thing. She was trying to make stronger borders and not always in a very good and healthy relationship with her own citizens. She even once happened to marry one of the lords who had proposed her. She uh, uh, she did try to marry, but the nobles did not allow her to marry because they told her that this way she will lose her grip over her country. So not just financial crisis, there were other crises like the international relations. They were also bad. So James I had to look into that as well. International relation means the relation a king has with other countries. So, say if somebody else comes in power after Modi, he has already ruined relationships with countries like China, Pakistan, Myanmar, Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka. So, the one who comes next has to fix everything up. Like you said, the challenges in front of the Pakistani prime minister have been so bad. One is the financial crisis that resulted because of the people who ruled before him. Money was drained. The second is the international relationships that have been ruined. They were declared the terrorist country in the world because of other people pushing and plotting against them. But what will this prime minister do? He has a lot to work on. The third thing that we see is the socio religious issues of the country. I cannot go into the detail. You must have been already familiar with what happened in the background, what social religious changes occur before this, what happens during Elizabethan time. Like I told you, during Mary, when Mary was ruling, she gets the Catholics killed. Sorry, the Protestants killed, and she tries to build a very strong relationship with France because France is where her mother comes from. Her mother was French, and also because France was Catholic. Why was France Catholic? Because France has a close proximity with Rome. It's very close to Rome, and Rome is where you see the Catholic Pope sits. So eventually, Mary was a Catholic, and it was followed by the rule of Queen Elizabeth, who was a Protestant. She gets Catholics killed, and she again has a very bad relationship with France, and France also excommunicates Queen Elizabeth. So, socio religious problems of the country are also there at hand for James I. What will he do? He himself is not a Catholic, he too is a Protestant. The difference between Catholics and Protestants is again not something that I can deal with here because this is supposed to be done when you do Reformation, when you do Renaissance. So these challenges are there with James I. Now, is Milton writing when James I is ruling? Is Milton writing when James I is ruling?
Um, he must be a young, yeah. He's a
Yeah.
young.
Yes, he is young. And is he writing?
Yes.
What do you think he has written?
I don't know the actual dates of his writings, but I think he must have started writing earlier. I'm guessing it.
25 is when his rule ends, right? 1625
Yeah.
minus 1608. What is his age
It's 25,
when James
5,
dies? 25 minus
8,
8.
8. It's 15 minus 8,
He is only, he's only,
70.
yeah. He's only
No,
17 and he has not seen a college yet. He
no.
starts writing when he enters college. This is
Okay.
in 1730. Sorry, 1630 is when he begins writing, and the first thing he writes is on Shakespeare. The poem is called On Shakespeare. So he may not be writing when James I is ruling, but he knows how the story was during the time of James I because he wasn't too young that he would not understand what was happening around at that time. People would get married at that age. Shakespeare himself was married at the age of 18. So, On Shakespeare is his first poetry that he writes in 1630 after entering college. But he knows the challenges James I has faced. He knows the challenges that were there in the country when James I died. It was during James I that a fight began between Protestants and Catholics. This is called 30 Years' War. 30 Years' War was a war between the Catholics and the Protestants. Why did this war begin? Earlier on, there was a treaty that was passed between the Catholics and the Protestants when Queen Elizabeth was there that there will be no intrusion of one with the other. And therefore, Queen Elizabeth was excommunicated because she followed a different sect of her own religion. She created another form of Christianity, which she called Anglicanism. Anglicanism is the English version of Christianity, that English people will have their own church, English people will have their own church, English people will have their own book of prayers. This book of prayers was initially compiled under Edward VI, and then it was rewritten under Queen Elizabeth. What was the change? Because book of prayers was based on Protestantism that Edward VI followed. And Queen Elizabeth also followed the same with some minor changes in the idea of Protestantism, where she adds the idea of nation being given priority and queen being treated as the church head. Queen becomes not just the political head, but also the religious head. That's what Anglicanism is. Earlier on, the head of the church was different, the bishop, and the head of the state was different, a king. And the king would consult the bishop for religious matters. But now, under Queen Elizabeth, the head of the state and religion, the head of the state and church was one. The head of the state and the church was one. She herself. So, what would that do? Means there would be no two decisions about any matter, but there would be one single person who takes decisions regarding the state and the church, political and religious. Something that you see is happening in India as well. One nation is one nation, one language, one everything is trying to be one head of everything. So 30 years war was the war where uh, the bishop that now came in France tried to force upon every other nation Catholicism. So Protestants rose against this idea that if things were settled under a peace treaty that was called Peace of Augsburg, that there will be no intrusion of one in the religious practice of the other. It was called Peace of Augsburg. But when this was broken up by the new Holy Roman Emperor, he comes from a family called Habsburg family. He belonged to the Habsburg family. He was the Holy Roman Emperor. His name was Ferdinand II. He spoils everything up by forcing Catholicism onto all the nations around Ferdinand II. What results is 30 years war begins. How does this affect James I? Because he's ruling a place that has Protestant majority but Catholic minority as well. There are Catholic minorities as well. They call themselves Puritans. We follow the purest form of religion, and Anglicanism is only an impurity added by the Queen. They call themselves Puritan, but they follow the form of religion that is called Catholicism. Is that clear? So far, so good.
Yeah.
Everything clear so far?
Yes.
Peace of Augsburg, clear?
Can you repeat after this? Like peace of
Peace of Augsburg was a treaty that was signed between France and the countries that followed Protestantism, between the bishop, the Holy Emperor of Rome. Holy Emperor of Rome. Earlier it was passed between the Holy Emperor of Rome and the rest of the nations that followed Protestantism.
Okay. Fine. Thank you.
It was called Peace of Augsburg, that there be no intrusion on what people want to follow in their religion. So Anglicanism came in, Anabaptism came in. These are the sects of Christianity. Baptism came in. I cannot go back into that. This must have been dealt with in semester one of your papers. I don't know how it's taught in your place, but all this goes into the background of that part. When Elizabeth, Mary, Edward VI, Henry VI, Henry VII, Henry VIII, Henry IV, 5, 6 are ruling. I will only deal with what happens under James I and those who follow James I. Now, 30 years war begins, and it takes a very long time. 30 years is not a very short span of time. And this is not a war between nations, but this is a war between two religious sects. 30 years war. What's the time period of this war? And you have to bear in mind, you have to find who are the rulers who are ruling at this period. 30 years war I am talking about. How long does it continue? When does it begin? It begins in 1618 plus 30 plus 30. Add 30 to 18.
'48.
This is the time period of 30 years war. Who is
Actually, I
ruling?
was talking about it as my mic was muted.
That's okay. So who was ruling at this time? It's not just James I. But James I has only ruled for 15 years that this crisis begins. James I is also called Rex Pacifus. This is the Roman Latin pronunciation, Rex Pacifus, whereas the British English pronunciation of it is Rex Pacifus. Both are right, Rex Pacifus or Rex Pacifus. Rex Pacifus means the ruler of uh, who loves peace, peace loving arbiter. So he begins creating peace, building peace with other nations like Spain, with country like France. The relations with these countries were very bad during the Tudor regime. So he is called Rex Pacifus as well. But soon after, in 1618, 30 Years' War begins, and he is helpless. Again, financial crisis builds on because he has to spend a lot on the war. He has to support the Protestant side of the war because this is the largest country that has Protestant population. Other than that, there is Bohemia. Bohemia becomes another center where Protestants are fighting. In this place, it is James I's son in law who is chosen as the ruler. The son in law of James I. This is also why he loses support of France, who are Catholics, because his son in law took over Bohemia and became the leader of the Protestants of Bohemia. This is why relations go very bad with the countries. And James I has to uh, give an inflow of money, of finances into the war because he has to support the army of Protestants. If he doesn't, the country, the citizens will go against him. He doesn't want to support it. But because the people are Protestants, he has to. The meeting will end soon, and let's take up questions. There is less than 1 minute left. Any questions you have so far?